A little boy, barefoot, trembling, tears streaking his face, runs desperately across the pavement. His small frame shakes as he clutches his arm, blood trickling down his skin. His sobs are broken, almost silent, as if he's afraid to make a sound. And then, he sees him. A mailman, a man who's walked these streets for years, delivering letters, newspapers, simple things. But today, he's about to receive something far more chilling than a package. The boy stumbles forward, grasping onto the man's uniform with shaking fingers. His lips part, but the words come out in broken whispers. He's not just asking for help, he's pleading for his life. But the most terrifying part? It's what's on his arm. A deep gash, old scars, bruises in the shape of something sinister. This isn't just an injury. This is a message. A warning. A secret that was never supposed to be revealed. The mailman's heart pounds. He looks around, nothing seems out of place. The apartment complex behind them is silent. Too silent. Blinds are drawn. A single door, slightly open, sways in the wind. And then, something shifts. Something you couldn't explain. Share your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. This story is just beginning. And trust me, you won't want to miss a second of it. Malik Johnson was only 7 years old, but his eyes told a different story. They weren't the eyes of a child who dreamed of superheroes or playground adventures. They were hollow, distant, like someone who had seen too much, someone who had learned too soon that monsters don't just exist in bedtime stories. The apartment complex where he lived wasn't the kind of place where people asked questions. It stood on the edge of Houston, a building worn down by time and silence. Neighbors moved in and out, and those who stayed long enough knew one thing: mind your business. The walls were thin, but the secrets they held were thick. Loud arguments that were suddenly cut short. Doors slammed in the middle of the night. Children who played outside one day and were never seen again. And then there was Malik. A boy who never played. A boy who never laughed. Teachers at school barely noticed him. He was quiet, withdrawn, always sitting at the back of the classroom. He never raised his hand. Never made eye contact. As if he had learned that drawing attention to himself could be dangerous. His clothes were always a little too big, his sneakers worn down to the sole. But the most unsettling thing? He never showed his arms. Even in the Houston heat, he wore long sleeves. Always. And people did notice. They just chose not to ask. Then there was Anthony Rogers. The mailman. For 15 years, he had walked these streets, delivering letters, bills, birthday cards, small glimpses into people's lives. He knew the neighborhood like the back of his hand. He knew which houses smelled like home-cooked meals, where kids played on porches, where families thrived. And he knew the places that felt off. Malik's apartment was one of them. Anthony had seen him before. Standing by the window, staring out like a caged bird. He never waved. Never smiled. But on some days, he would press his small hands against the glass, watching as the world moved on without him. And then there were the noises. Anthony never made a habit of listening in on people's lives, but sometimes, the sounds forced their way through. The muffled cries. The frantic whispers. The occasional crash of something heavy hitting the floor. He had considered calling someone. But who? The police? They had been there before, flashing lights, quick knocks on the door, then nothing. No arrests. No real change. But there was something different about today. Malik wasn't behind that window. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. Today, he had run. And that meant whatever was inside that apartment, whatever he was running from, was worse than the fear of stepping outside. Anthony knew this wasn't just another delivery. Something was very wrong. And if he didn't act fast, he might be the last person to see Malik alive. Stay with me, because this story is just beginning. The truth about what was happening inside that apartment is more disturbing than you can imagine. And once it's uncovered, there will be one question left to ask. Why didn't anyone stop this sooner? Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from. Have you ever felt like something was wrong in your neighborhood, but you weren't sure what to do? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. This is a story that needs to be heard. It happened so fast that Anthony Rogers barely had time to react. One moment, he was sorting through his mailbag, preparing to drop off a few letters. The next, a small figure burst through the front door of the apartment complex like a bullet fired from a gun. Malik. The boy was running. Barefoot. Breathless. Tears streamed down his face, his little chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked gasps. His tiny frame shuddered as if the very air around him was too heavy to carry. His movements were frantic, like a cornered animal, like someone who knew that if he stopped, even for a second, it would be the end. Anthony froze. This wasn't just a child crying. This wasn't a scraped knee or a temper tantrum. This was fear. A fear so raw, so suffocating, that it wrapped itself around the boy like an invisible chain. And then Malik saw him. The boy didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. He just ran straight into Anthony's legs, clutching onto his uniform with trembling fingers. He buried his face into the fabric, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. And that's when Anthony felt it. The dampness. Not sweat. Not just tears. Warm. Sticky. Blood. Anthony's stomach clenched. He pulled back just enough to see, and what he saw made his breath hitch in his throat. Malik's arm. Bruises. Deep, ugly, spreading like ink beneath his skin. Some looked like they had been there for weeks, others fresh, swelling under the sunlight. But that wasn't the worst part. There were cuts. Some shallow. Some deep. Some carved in deliberate patterns, jagged and cruel, as if someone had taken their time, marking him, owning him. Anthony's hands trembled. Malik, he whispered, his voice barely steady. Who did this to you? The boy sniffled, his tiny fingers tightening in desperation. His voice was so small, so fragile, that Anthony had to lean in to hear him. Please don't take me back, they hurt me at night. Anthony felt his breath catch. The words sent a chill through his spine, slicing through the warm Houston air like a cold blade. They hurt me at night. Not, I fell. Not, it was an accident. Not even, someone hit me. They hurt me at night. This wasn't a single incident. This was routine. This was horror, creeping into the darkness when the world wasn't watching. Anthony looked up, heart pounding against his ribs. The apartment complex loomed behind them, quiet. Too quiet. The front door, now swinging slightly open, was a gaping mouth, black and empty, swallowing whatever secrets lay inside. Something told him, someone was watching. He could feel it. A presence. A weight pressing down on his back, on his shoulders. The unmistakable sensation of unseen eyes tracking his every move. He had to make a decision. Right now. Call the police. Walk Malik away. Demand answers. Every second counted. But as Anthony looked down at the terrified child in his arms, he realized something chilling. This wasn't just about Malik. There was something bigger here. Something worse. And whatever it wasn't going to let him go so easily. Stay with me. Because the nightmare is just beginning. What Anthony would uncover next would send shockwaves through the city, because Malik wasn't the first child to cry for help in the shadows of this neighborhood. And if no one acted now, he wouldn't be the last. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed something that didn't feel right, something that made you question what was happening behind closed doors? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, and share this video. Because what happens next? You won't believe it. Anthony's hands were still trembling. He could feel Malik's tiny fingers gripping his shirt, refusing to let go, as if the moment he did, someone, would snatch him away. He had to think. Fast. His first instinct was to call the police. Report this. Get Malik to safety. But deep down, he knew the reality, he had seen it too many times before. How many times had Child Protective Services stepped in, only for a child to be sent right back into the hands of their abusers? How many times had the system failed the ones who needed it most? What if he made the call, and they just took Malik back? His pulse pounded against his temples. The boy was trembling against him, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Anthony crouched, trying to meet his eyes. Malik, he said gently. Who's hurting you? The boy hesitated, swallowing hard. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His gaze flicked toward the apartment complex, toward that dark, half-open door. And then, Anthony saw it. Panic. Not the fear of a child caught in trouble. Not the fear of a scraped knee or a scolding. This was something else. A terror so deep, so consuming, that it silenced him. Anthony knew that kind of fear. It was the kind that didn't come from a single bad night. It was the kind that had been lived over and over again. The kind that made a child too afraid to even speak it out loud. A shadow moved behind the blinds of the second-floor window. Anthony stiffened. Someone was watching. He couldn't stand here. Not like this. Not in the open. He had to move. Now. His grip tightened around Malik's small hand, and without another word, he led him away from the apartment complex, around the corner, to the far end of the block where an old chain-link fence separated the street from a row of abandoned houses. Stay here, he whispered, crouching beside Malik. I'll be right back. The boy's grip tightened on Anthony's sleeve. Don't leave me. Anthony exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had to know more before he made a move. He needed answers. He spotted someone up ahead, an older woman sitting on her porch, watching the world go by. Ms. Dolores. She had been here for decades. If anyone knew what was really happening in that apartment, it was her. He approached quickly. Ms. Dolores, he said, keeping his voice low. The boy, Malik. Do you know what's happening to him? She didn't react at first. Just kept staring at the road, her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. Why are you asking? Her voice was quiet. Careful. I just saw him run out of that building. Barefoot. Bleeding. Crying. Anthony's voice hardened. Something is happening to him, and I know you know what it is. MS. Dolores swallowed, looking toward the apartment complex. The way her eyes flickered, hesitation, fear, told him everything. She knew. She had always known. After a long pause, she exhaled sharply. They got secrets in there, she murmured. Things nobody talks about. Anthony's jaw clenched. What kind of things? She shook her head. That boy ain't the first one to come out of there looking like that. A chill ran down Anthony's spine. What do you mean? She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Few years back, there was another child. Same apartment. Same fear in his eyes. He was here one day, gone the next. No police. No news. Just gone. Anthony's heart pounded. Did anyone report it? Ms. Dolores scoffed. And tell who? The cops that come and do nothing. The folks who show up, ask a few questions, and drive off like it never happened. She shook her head, her voice bitter. This ain't the first time, and if you don't do something fast, it won't be the last. Anthony's stomach twisted. He looked back toward the corner where he had left Malik. He had a choice to make. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen what he saw, just like everyone else had done before. Or he could finally break the cycle. But whatever was inside that apartment complex, whatever Malik was too afraid to speak about, wasn't going to let him go so easily. Stay with me, because what Anthony does next, it changes everything. And once the truth comes out, there will be no turning back. Before we continue, tell me, what would you do? If you saw a child in danger, but the system kept failing them, would you step in? Or would you walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Anthony's pulse was racing, his mind a battlefield of decisions he didn't have time to process. He turned back toward the apartment complex, watching the way the curtains on the second floor shifted ever so slightly, like someone was standing just behind them. Watching. Waiting. And then, the door creaked open. A man stepped outside. Tall. Broad shoulders. A slow, heavy gait. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the street. Darnell Simmons. Malik's mother's boyfriend. A name whispered in hushed voices. A face people learned to avoid. Anthony had seen him before. Not often, but enough. A man who never worked but always had money. A man who could disappear for weeks at a time, only to return with new cars, new jewelry, never explaining where it all came from. A man who had been arrested more times than anyone could count. But never convicted. Darnell walked to the edge of the steps, stretching his neck like a predator surveying its territory. His eyes moved slowly, lazily, before locking onto Anthony. He smirked. You look lost, Mailman. Anthony stood his ground, heart hammering in his chest. That little boy, Malik, he ran out here bleeding. Darnell raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. That so? His voice was slow, deliberate. Kids fall all the time. Anthony clenched his fists. That wasn't a fall. Darnell let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. He took a slow step forward, then another. Let me tell you something, man. You walk this street every day, right? Been doing it for years? Anthony said nothing. Darnell's grin widened. Then you know how this works. You keep your head down. You deliver your mail. And you mind your damn business. A chill crawled down Anthony's spine. This wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. And Darnell wasn't just some abusive boyfriend. He was something much worse. Anthony didn't need to be told twice. He knew the type. Men like Darnell didn't just hurt people. They owned them. Controlled them. Made them disappear when they became a problem. And Malik? Malik was a problem. Anthony took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Where's his mother? Darnell's smirk faded. His jaw tensed. Gone. One word. Flat. Cold. Anthony's stomach twisted. Before he could respond, Darnell took another step forward, his presence swallowing the space between them. Listen, man, he said, voice barely above a whisper. That kid ain't your concern. He got a home. He got food. Ain't nobody hurting him. He leaned in slightly, eyes dark. Dead. And if I were you, I'd let this whole thing go. Anthony didn't move. Didn't speak. Because if he did, if he so much as twitched, he knew Darnell would see it, see the fear, and he couldn't afford that. Not now. Not when Malik's life depended on him. He forced himself to nod, to keep his face blank, to turn away and walk back down the street as if he was just another man minding his own business. But inside? Inside, he was raging. Because now, he understood. This wasn't just an abusive household. This was bigger. Something deeper. Something dangerous. And as he walked away, he started to notice things he hadn't before. The way neighbors quickly shut their doors when Darnell passed. The way children stopped playing when he stepped outside. The way nobody, not one person, dared to look him in the eye. And then, the whispers began. Anthony spoke to Ms. Dolores again. Then another neighbor. Then another. And slowly, too slowly, the pieces started falling into place. Malik wasn't the only child who had lived in that apartment. There had been others. Other children who had run. Other children who had vanished. No reports. No investigations. Just gone. And nobody ever asked questions. Because people who asked questions, they disappeared, too. Anthony knew he was running out of time. And so did Malik. Later that night, when Anthony found the boy huddled in the corner of his porch, shaking and silent, the child finally spoke again. His voice was barely audible, a ghost of a whisper in the dark. They told me if I talked, I'd disappear too. Stay with me. Because what happens next? It's worse than anything you could ever imagine. Before we continue, tell me. What would you do if you were in Anthony's shoes? Would you risk everything to save Malik? Or would you walk away before it was too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, and share this video. Because this story, it's far from over. Anthony had done everything he could think of. He made the call. He reported the bruises, the fear in Malik's eyes, the strange way the neighbors spoke in whispers, like they knew something but were too scared to say it out loud. And yet, when the police arrived, their response was frustratingly predictable. A patrol car rolled up, slow and uninterested, as if responding to a noise complaint instead of a potential case of child abuse. Two officers stepped out, one barely glancing at his notepad as he listened to Anthony recount what happened. They knocked on the apartment door. No answer. They knocked again. A long silence. Then, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. The door cracked open. Darnell. Calm. Unbothered. A cigarette dangling from his lips, the glow of it barely flickering as he exhaled a slow stream of smoke. Problem, officers. His voice was smooth. Controlled. Like a man who had done this before. Anthony held his breath, waiting for the police to demand answers, to push their way inside, to do something. Instead, they barely looked at him. "Sir, we got a call about a disturbance," one officer said, shifting lazily on his feet. "Something about a kid running outside?" Darnell scoffed. "That so?" He turned his head slightly, pretending to think. "Yeah, Malik got scared earlier. Had a little tantrum. You know how kids are." He shook his head, chuckling. "Boy got a wild imagination." Anthony's stomach twisted. That wasn't what happened. The boy was running for his life. But the officers, they weren't pushing. One of them gave a slow nod. "You mind if we speak with him?" Darnell shrugged. "He's asleep." A long pause. Then, unbelievably, the officer sighed. "Well, if he's not hurt, we can't really do much," he muttered, flipping his notepad shut. Anthony felt the shift. The moment the officers decided they were done. That this was just another call. Just another hassle. Just another problem they didn't want to solve. And Darnell? Darnell knew it too. The smug smirk that curled at the corner of his lips was barely there, but Anthony saw it. Felt it. The officers turned to leave. Just like that. Anthony felt something break inside him. That's it. His voice was sharper than he intended, his frustration spilling out. You're not gonna look inside. You're not gonna check on Malik. The first officer sighed again, rubbing a hand down his face. Look, sir, unless there's solid evidence of neglect or abuse, we can't force our way in. He gave Anthony a tired look, like a man who had done this 100 times before and didn't care anymore. If you're concerned, report it to CPS. Anthony had. He had already reported it. But something inside him told him that wasn't going to be enough. The officers climbed back into their car. And Darnell? Darnell lingered in the doorway, staring at Anthony as the patrol car rolled away. He took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly before flashing a wide, lazy grin. Appreciate your concern, Mailman. His voice dripped with amusement. But you should really learn to mind your business. And with that, he closed the door. But Anthony wasn't done. If the police weren't going to do anything, he'd find someone who would. That's when he remembered. A name. A man. Detective Samuel Grayson. A retired homicide detective, a man who had worked this district for decades before walking away from the force. People said he left because of corruption, that he had seen too much and couldn't stomach the system anymore. Anthony had delivered mail to his house for years. And if there was anyone who might listen, who might see what the police refused to, it was him. Anthony wasted no time. That night, he knocked on Grayson's door. The old detective answered, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the mailman standing on his porch at almost midnight. You're here about the kid, aren't you? Anthony froze. Grayson sighed, stepping aside. Come in. We need to talk. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and old case files. Stacks of papers littered the table, cold cases, crime scene photos, missing person reports. And there, right in the middle of it all, was a file on Malik's apartment complex. Anthony's breath caught. You already knew. Grayson ran a hand over his face. Not about the boy. But about that building? Yeah. He tapped a yellow document on the table. I worked a case there 15 years ago. Anthony's skin prickled. A case? Grayson nodded. A little girl. 6 years old. She lived in that same apartment. His voice darkened. She went missing. Anthony's stomach dropped. What happened? Grayson exhaled sharply. Nothing. No body. No suspects. No one would talk. He shook his head. And the reports? Every single file on that case vanished. Anthony swallowed hard. Just like Malik's. Grayson's head snapped up. Anthony clenched his fists. I reported him. I called CPS. But when I checked today, his case was gone. Like it was never filed. A silence fell between them. Then, the old detective sat back, rubbing his jaw. This is bigger than I thought. Anthony's throat was dry. What do we do? Grayson met his gaze. We find out what's really happening inside that apartment. Stay with me. Because this story is unraveling fast. And what Anthony and Grayson would uncover next. It would shake the city of Houston to its core. Before we continue, tell me, have you ever heard of a case that just disappeared? A report that never got filed? A crime that was swept under the rug? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, and share this video. Because the truth, it's finally coming to light. Anthony knew they were out of time. The system had already failed Malik once. The police had shrugged it off. The reports had vanished. And Darnell? He was still out there. Watching. Waiting. Smirking. Malik was still trapped inside that apartment, locked behind doors that held secrets no one wanted to uncover. Anthony wasn't a cop. He wasn't a detective. But he wasn't about to let this go. He had started this fight alone. But now, he wasn't alone. Detective Grayson sat across from him, flipping through the old case files. His jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against the table in deep thought. And next to them, Maya Ellis. A reporter. One of the few left who still cared about stories that mattered. She had spent years exposing corruption, chasing down leads that no one else would touch. And when Anthony told her about Malik, about the missing case files, about the pattern of disappearing children, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her recorder, her notepad, and said, "Let's bring this to light." They had a plan. Expose the truth. Make enough noise that the police couldn't ignore it. That Child Protective Services couldn't erase it. It started with an article. Maya published a scathing report: missing files, missing children, what's happening inside Houston's forgotten neighborhoods. She named names. She listed every child who had disappeared from that apartment complex over the past 15 years. She called out CPS. The police. The landlords who kept renting out those units despite the growing list of tragedies tied to them. The article went viral. People started talking. Asking questions. Sharing the names of more children who had gone missing without a trace. And finally, the pressure became too much. Houston PD had no choice. They sent a team. Anthony and Grayson stood across the street as the squad cars pulled up, blue and red lights flashing against the dark windows of the apartment complex. Officers filed out, weapons drawn, their faces tense. Then came the order. Go in. The door was kicked open. The silence that followed was thick. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. And then, a scream. Not Malik's. A woman's. Officers flooded in, voices barking orders. The sounds of heavy boots thudding against old wooden floors, doors slamming open, drawers being ripped from their hinges. And then, one of the officers called out. "We found something." Anthony didn't breathe. He and Grayson rushed forward just as another officer came out, his face pale. "There's a room," he muttered. It was locked from the outside. Anthony's stomach twisted. And Malik? The officer hesitated. We found him." Anthony pushed past before anyone could stop him. Inside, the air was stale. Wrong. And then, he saw it. The room. The locks. The small, makeshift bed shoved into the corner. The bucket beside it. The bare walls. The windows screwed shut. And Malik. Curled in the corner, shaking, eyes wide with terror. Anthony's throat closed up. He moved fast, kneeling beside the boy, hands hovering over his arms. "Malik," he whispered. "It's me. You're safe now." But the boy didn't move. Didn't blink. And then, his tiny, trembling hand lifted. Pointing. Anthony followed his gaze, his pulse stopping when he saw it. A camera. Hidden in the ceiling vent. A small red light blinking. Recording. Anthony's skin crawled. And that's when he saw the desk. A single ledger lay open, pages covered in handwritten notes. Numbers. Names. His fingers clenched as he turned the pages, bile rising in his throat. Children's names. Ages. Dates. Prices. Malik's name was there. Anthony barely had time to register it before the officers erupted in shouts. "Subject is fleeing. On the roof, repeat, suspect is on the roof. Darnell." He was running. Anthony bolted. By the time he reached the stairwell, officers were already storming up, their radios buzzing with commands. He reached the top just in time to see Darnell sprinting across the rooftop, wind whipping against his clothes. A moment of hesitation. A glance at the alley below. A split-second decision. Darnell jumped. And missed. The sound of his body hitting the pavement sent a sickening echo through the night. Anthony stood frozen, breath coming in short, sharp bursts as officers rushed past him. It was over. It was finally over. Or so he thought. Because in the coming days, as the investigation unfolded, more names surfaced. More missing reports. More erased files. Malik wasn't the first child to be locked away in that room. And he wasn't the only one on that list. Stay with me. Because what comes next? It's worse than we ever imagined. Before we continue, tell me, have you ever seen something suspicious in your own neighborhood? Something that didn't sit right? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, and share this video. Because this story, it's not over yet. The truth was worse than Anthony ever imagined. It had all happened so fast, the raid, the locked room, the camera hidden in the ceiling. But it was what they found after that sent the real shockwaves. Because Malik, he wasn't just another case of child abuse. He was marked. A ledger. Handwritten notes. Names. Dates. And beside Malik's name, a single word scribbled in red ink. Removal, pending. Anthony's breath had caught the moment he saw it. Malik was never supposed to leave that apartment alive. Had he waited even one more day to speak up, to push back, to make noise, Malik would have been gone. Just like the others. Just another child who vanished from the system without a trace. A race against time. And by pure luck or something else, Malik had survived it. But then came the worst part. The investigation uncovered something bigger. Darker. This wasn't just about Malik. It wasn't just about Darnell. This wasn't just a household of abuse, it was a business. It started with whispers. Hushed conversations between the detectives. An officer stepping outside to take a deep breath like he was about to be sick. Then, a single phrase. Foster Care Assistance Program. Anthony's skin went cold. The files were pulled. Reports cross-checked. And just like that, the real truth came out. Darnell Simmons wasn't just an abusive man. He was part of a system. A network of criminals who posed as unofficial, foster caregivers for at-risk children. Children who were shuffled between different addresses, never staying in one place too long. Children who disappeared when it was convenient. And no one questioned it. Because as far as the system was concerned, these children had no one. No families looking for them. No caseworkers following up. Just names on paper that could be erased. And Malik? Malik had been next. Anthony gripped the edges of the table as the realization hit him like a freight train. This entire time, Malik hadn't just been a scared little boy trying to escape a bad home. He had been running for his life. And the scariest part? Darnell was just one piece of it. A small piece. The more detectives dug, the more names surfaced. And the more names surfaced, the more cases they found that had been quietly buried. Malik's file wasn't the only one that had disappeared. There were dozens. Maybe more. And the real question wasn't how deep this went. It was who else knew. And how many more children were still out there, waiting, running, pleading for someone to notice before it was too late. Stay with me, because this story isn't over. Not yet. And what happens next? It changes everything. Before we continue, tell me, have you ever heard of a case where a child just vanished? A report that was ignored? A system that failed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, and share this video. Because stories like this, they need to be heard. The news spread fast. Darnell Simmons, arrested. More names surfaced. More arrests were made. Investigators dug deeper, uncovering a tangled web of missing reports, falsified documents, and children who had simply vanished from the system. But the real question: how many were too late to save? Malik had survived. But he was only one. For every Malik, how many other children had been erased? How many had cried out for help but never been heard? The system wasn't broken, it was designed this way. Designed to let kids slip through the cracks, to turn a blind eye when the paperwork didn't add up, to pretend these children never existed at all. And now? Now, people were asking questions. Now, people wanted answers. But answers wouldn't bring those children back. Anthony sat in silence outside the courthouse, listening as reporters shouted questions at the officers escorting Darnell in cuffs. The cameras flashed. The headlines painted their hero stories. But none of it felt like justice. Justice would have meant stopping this before it got this far. Before a 7-year-old boy had to run barefoot and bleeding into the arms of a mailman. Malik was safe. Finally. But safe didn't mean healed. He barely spoke. Barely ate. He still flinched when a door slammed too loud. Still woke up in the middle of the night, eyes darting around as if he was still trapped in that locked room. Because even though Darnell was gone, the fear wasn't. And maybe it never would be. The foster system placed Malik in protective custody, a new home far from the city where no one could find him. But what did that really mean? Another stranger's house. Another round of uncertainty. Another attempt to rebuild a childhood that had been shattered before it had a chance to begin. Anthony visited him once. Sat with him on a park bench as the boy traced invisible lines in the dirt with his shoe. What happens now? Malik had whispered, his voice barely there. Anthony didn't have an answer. Because how do you tell a child who has spent his whole life running that he doesn't have to anymore? How do you promise him safety when the world had already taught him that safety doesn't exist? So instead, Anthony asked him a question. What do you want to happen now? Malik hesitated. His little fingers curled against the fabric of his shirt. And for the first time since Anthony had met him, he said something without fear. I don't want to be scared anymore. And that? That was the real fight. Not just for Malik. For every child who had been forgotten. Every child who had learned that silence was safer than speaking. Every child who had whispered into the dark, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. Anthony never saw himself as a hero. But when the reporters asked him what made him get involved, what made him care enough to do something, he only had one answer. Because if I hadn't, who would have? And that's the question we should all be asking. How many more Maliks are out there? Crying for help. Waiting for someone to notice. Praying that, just once, someone will care enough to stop. To ask questions. To push back against a system that buries them alive. Because Malik survived. But next time, we might be too late. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about Malik. It's about every child who never got the chance to escape. And now, I need you to speak. Have you ever seen something that didn't sit right? A child who seemed afraid, a situation that felt off. Would you step in? Or would you keep walking? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. This story started with a little boy running, barefoot, terrified, desperate. It started with a single moment. A moment where someone could have turned away. A moment where the easy choice would have been to keep walking. But one man stopped. And because he stopped, a dark secret was uncovered. Because he stopped, the truth was finally dragged into the light. Because he stopped, Malik survived. But this story isn't just about Malik. It's about the children who never got the chance to run. The ones whose names were written in ledgers but never spoken again. The ones who disappeared, not because no one saw, but because no one wanted to see. And now I have a question for you. Have you ever noticed something in your neighborhood that didn't feel right? A child who seemed afraid? A situation that made you stop and wonder? What would you do? Would you step in? Or would you look the other way? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about this. Let's make sure Malik's story isn't forgotten. Because somewhere out there, another child is waiting. Waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for someone to care. And if this story taught us anything, it's that one person, one choice, can change everything. If you haven't already, like, subscribe, and share this video. Because stories like this, they need to be told. And the next one, it's even darker. Stay tuned.